Hi, everyone. We're going to get started here in just a few minutes, but we do want to give it a chance for the room to populate because, as always, a lot of people have registered for this program, so we're quite excited for it. And while we do that, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Everyone should be able to see my presentation. Well, I'm going to go ahead and welcome everyone to this May C2C Care webinar. We are doing this webinar I always like to say in celebration, but in acknowledgement of the fact that it is May, so May Day 2025. We're going to talk a little bit about that in a minute, but until then, I do want to let you know that you're here for about an hour-long webinar. So now what? Dealing with materials after a disaster. We're going to be running from about 1:30 to 2:30 p.m. Eastern, and we should have a pretty jam-packed program today. My name is Robin Bauer-Kilgo. I am the C2C Care Coordinator. You can reach me at any time at c2cc@culturalheritage.org. And while we have everyone coming in, I always like to highlight our website. We actually have a pretty newer website, kind of a refreshed website at connectingtocollections.org. On that website, you will be able to gain access to our vast back catalog of webinars. We've been doing webinars for over 10 years, so I would encourage you to go digging around those archives if you're ever interested in them. We also have an archive of courses you can access. The courses are there as kind of a deep dive into different subjects in the collections care realm. And finally, we have a link to our community. The community is a moderated community space where people can ask direct questions, direct collection questions. And from there, they will get this fabulous group of volunteer monitors and experts to help you get good answers to your direct care questions. So I would encourage you to go check that out as well. I do have an announcement about our program. So as we have shared in the C2C Care community recently, we have not been able to access our IMLS grant funding in support of C2C Care since March, which was originally how we were funded through a federal program. The grant was officially terminated on April 28th, so we did get our official letter, unfortunately, but we want to thank an anonymous donor and the Samuel H. Kress Foundation for stepping in to support this webinar and other C2C Care programming, allowing it to continue through the summer. If you're able to join them in supporting C2C Care, please consider donating, and I'll be putting a link in the chat in a moment that you guys can actually do it. So we're kind of turning into a self-funded program at this point. We've had a lot of great support from people. We've heard from a lot of people. We're very happy to hear how much C2C Care has reached out to the community. So if you're able to do anything to help, it's appreciated. We are doing programming through the summer, so keep an eye out for a June, July, and August webinar. And after that, we will be talking to the community about how kind of a reimagined C2C Care will be progressing. So again, thank you, especially a personal thank you to everyone. And we will continue on with our programming as long as we can. We also have 2 spots that you can keep up with programming announcements outside of our website that I always like to put out. One is on Facebook and one is on LinkedIn. So I encourage you to go follow those 2 channels if you are able to. And just as a quick reminder for today's program, we are using Zoom webinar. A Zoom webinar, you're able to talk to us via the chat. You guys are doing a great job at that, so I don't feel like I have to explain the chat, but I will add that if you would want to ask a question of any of our presenters, we really encourage you to use the Q&A box. That allows us to track the questions a little easier throughout the actual program, so please use that if we can. We also should be enabling captioning in a few minutes for this program, so keep an eye out for that CC button down at the bottom. So with that, these are a group of our fabulous presenters today. We're going to be talking again about just dealing with materials after disaster. But before we get to our 3 presenters, I get to introduce Christy Kane, who's the FAIC Emergency Manager, to talk a little bit about May Day and kind of what involves that. So Christy, feel free to take over, and I will return at the end of the Q&A period.
There we go. Yeah, thank you so much, Robin. Like Robin said, I'm Christina Kane. I am the Emergency Programs Manager for the Foundation for Advancement and Conservation. And I wanted to share with you something a little bit about our programs. Hopefully you're familiar with our National Heritage Responders. This is a core group of volunteers who respond when there's a disaster affecting cultural heritage and we've exceeded local capacity. It's important everybody have our hotline written down. It's a 24/7 hotline for institutions to use in any kind of an emergency. That is 202-661-8068. For individuals or institutions, you're also welcome to use our NHR public helpline at culturalheritage.org to get in touch with National Heritage Responder volunteers. Also, we have our Alliance for Response, which is a group of networks in various states and regions that are local emergency professionals and cultural heritage professionals working together to respond to emergencies. If you are interested in either joining a Alliance for Response or finding out more or creating one, please email me at emergencies@culturalheritage.org. And you can see the map on the bottom. All those green dots are our current Alliance for Response networks, and all the blue dots are our current National Heritage Responder volunteers. So we hope to get you involved in one or both of those in the future. Next, I want to talk a little bit about May Day, which is the collaboration that we're doing today with C2C Care. And the idea behind May Day is that you do one thing for preparedness, just one thing. If you do more, that's wonderful. What we'd like, there's a few ideas here on the screen for you: updating your phone tree, adding our hotline number, creating a pocket response plan, which I will put the link to, a template for that in the chat shortly. Create a supply cache, identify your priority objects for evacuation and salvage, or plan a staff training. There's a lot of them, a lot of ideas available on our website as well. Once you've done something, please do take our survey. The QR code is there on the screen to get to our survey, and I'll put the link in the chat as well for later. And if you do take the survey, you are entered to win a free registration to one of our C2C Care webinars that will be happening in the future. So that's it for me, and I'm going to hand it over to Tara.
Thanks, Christy. I will be sharing my screen here. Alrighty. So, hi everyone. I'm Tara Kennedy. Besides working at Yale, I'm also one of the National Heritage Responders that Christy mentioned in her presentation. My background is in emergency response and health and safety, so I'll be talking to you today about how you can protect yourself and those around you when working with to recover items after disasters. We hope will be helpful information, and there will be accompanying resources, a QR code at the end to assist you with any potential recovery processes that you may encounter in the future. So I just want to add this disclaimer. This presentation is not meant, to substitute for medical advice from a professional. The information is general in nature. If you have specific medical conditions or situations, please consult a licensed medical professional. So this presentation will cover these 4 areas. Why are health and safety important? What hazards do I need to be aware of? How can I protect myself and others? And what resources are available to help us? So I'll start off talking about why health and safety are important, especially in a disaster situation. In all emergency situations, human life will take precedent over collections recovery. You can't save your collections if you're not feeling well. So if you consider this, the 5 minutes that it takes for you to put on your proper personal protective equipment, also known as PPE, could save you a lifetime in potential chronic illness. So take those 5 minutes. So why else are health and safety important? In some cases, it's actually required. So the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, better known as the acronym OSHA, has requirements for workers to wear personal protective equipment when working in an emergency response situation, especially when the emergency response site is a federal, state, or local government entity. Lastly, health and safety are often the last thing people are thinking about when they're responding in an emergency situation. People are concerned about recovering collections, helping others, and often they forget to even protect themselves. So just like the flight attendants say, remember to put on your mask first before assisting others. So it's important to understand the risk to your safety and health even after the event is over. The remnants left behind after an event may contain contaminants that are harmful to you. So here are the big three after effects that I'm going to talk about that you will probably need to be aware of: fire remnants, floodwater contaminants, and of course our friend mold. So the first hazard I'm going to talk about is in fire remnants are fire smoke, soot, and ash. Fire smoke is composed of gases and particles resulting from the burning of materials present during the fire, including food, plastics, fabrics, wood, and metals. Soot are the carbon-based deposits that did not complete combustion during the fire, and ash is a byproduct from the fire that was incombustible materials. Fire smoke can contain soot and ash particles that are incredibly small, which in turn can cause serious respiratory problems. So what other hazards might there be in the fire? In the soot and ashes, there could be any of the following listed in this slide: heavy metals, asbestos, PCBs, organic compounds, and microplastics. Why? Historic buildings are older and may have been built before certain hazardous building materials were outlawed or no longer used. So some examples of that are lead-based paint would have been used in buildings built before the late 1970s. Some buildings that were treated with arsenic to control termites. Beyond buildings, arsenic was also used as an herbicide and a rodenticide in the past, so that also could have been stirred up as a result of the fire. Historic structures also could contain asbestos, which could be found in fire ash, which can cause cancer if inhaled. It is found in insulation, floor and ceiling tile, and other building components used between the early 1940s through the 1970s. The other problematic elements are the contemporary materials that would have been in people's homes or places of business, such as plastics and carpeting. Plastics and other manufactured materials could contain PCBs or polychlorinated biphenyls. Say that 3 times fast. PCBs are a substance that was used in many different industrial and commercial applications, like pigments, dyes, and carbonless copy paper. Plasticizers in paints, plastics, and rubber products, and it was also used in fluorescent light ballasts. They were banned in 1979 because they were deemed a carcinogen, along with them causing immunity, reproductive, and neurological problems. And there may be other materials in the soot and ash and in the water supply as a result of the burning of modern plastics, including chemical compounds and microplastics. What about floodwaters? Floodwater can contain any and all of the following: infectious organisms, fuels, industrial or agricultural chemicals, including heavy metals, and wildlife such as mosquitoes, which can carry disease, and alligators, snakes, and rats, oh my, also might appear. I guess rats know how to swim. Uh, so you should assume that all floodwaters and anything that is wet with floodwater could potentially be contaminated. So I'll give you an example of contaminated floodwaters. In 2017, Hurricane Harvey caused contaminated floodwaters in the Houston area that was well covered in media outlets. Due to the number of petrochemical plants and refineries in the Houston area, benzene was a common contaminant found in the floodwaters. Pesticides were another contaminant that were also found in the floodwaters. It was due to exposure from the water with fields that use pesticides. And according to the New York Times articles that were written at the time about Hurricane Harvey, bacteria such as E. coli from sewage contamination and heavy metals like lead and arsenic were found in standing water in one Houston family's living room after the floods. And that was because 40 of the 1,219 wastewater treatment plants were not in operation after the hurricane. Bacterial count was extremely high. So you should assume all water is hazardous until local authorities deem it safe. Bottled water is your safest option for drinking. Water contaminated with fuel and other chemicals will not be made safe by boiling or disinfection. And water-soaked ash can also cause chemical burns if it comes into contact with skin or mucous membranes. Another hazard in wet environments is mold. Mold risk is high in these environments. High humidity, plenty of moisture, and many sources of organic materials make it prime conditions for mold to thrive and propagate. Mold grows well on paper, drywall, and carpets. And it's also important to recognize that all molds can pose a health risk and that some people are just more at risk than others. It is truly dependent on the person rather than the actual type of mold. That those most at risk are usually those with compromised immune systems, people who have respiratory illnesses or asthma, people who have allergies to molds, mushrooms, or penicillin. In truth, there are molds that are inherently toxic, such as Stachybotrys chatarum, which is seen growing on water-damaged gypsum wallboard in this picture here that you see. But it is best to assume that all mold is a health risk. That way, you will always protect yourself and others if you encounter mold when you're on site and working. So, how can you protect yourself and others? When working with materials exposed to floods, fires, or mold, be sure you're protected. Use the SHELF acronym as your checklist to ensure that you are fully protected. So you want to have skin protection, hand protection, eye protection, lung protection, a respirator, and foot protection. A respirator is also called an N95 mask or a filtering half face mask. These are the same types of masks that we were instructed to use during the COVID-19 pandemic. For for skin protection, Tyvek coveralls or suits are a great way to protect your skin because of the potential chemical hazards associated within wet ash, soot, floodwaters. You want to be sure to cover as much of your exposed skin as you can to prevent skin from coming into contact with any of the fire remnants or any of the floodwaters. Washable long sleeve shirts and long pants are also acceptable, but Tyvek may be favorable in floodwater situations because it is water resistant. Disposable nitrile gloves. You want to get unpowdered versions of nitrile gloves. And if you can find ones with extra long cuffs, like you see in the picture here, that's even better protection, just in case your sleeves happen to ride up, as often happens when you're working. It's often difficult to notice fine details like that while you're in the middle of recovery work. So it's good to cover your bases early to make sure that you're fully protected. And double gloving is also helpful in case one glove happens to tear. Goggles are useful for protecting your eyes from any particles or irritants that might get in your eyes, and they're especially important if you're on-site recovering materials. Small particles of soot and ash can easily be stirred up in the air and blown around, and floodwaters might splash and get into your eyes. So even while you're working and cleaning in an enclosed space, wearing eye protection is a great way to remind yourself not to touch your eyes while you're working. A respirator. At minimum, you should wear a NIOSH approved, well-fitting N95 half face mask. Ideally, a half mask respiratory with for P100 cartridges is what you should wear to give you ultimate protection from the teeny particles of soot and ash, mold, and other hazardous materials that you might breathe in. Cloth masks will not protect you. Like those things we used to make, we made during the pandemics, bandanas, those sorts of things. No. Fire ash may be irritating to the nose and throat and may cause coughing and nosebleeds. Fine particles and mold spores can be inhaled deeply into lungs and may aggravate asthma and make it difficult to breathe. This is why wearing respiratory protection is so critical. Do a seal check, seal test check, seal check test to make sure that the respirator forms a good seal around your face before beginning work. Instructions on how to put on and remove N95s and half mask respirators will be included in the resource packet at the end of this presentation. So I wanted to provide a slide to give you a visual presentation of masks that won't protect you. Dust masks do not provide a good enough seal around your nose and mouth, nor do they filter out small enough particles. Medical masks are to prevent you from spreading germs, not to protect you from the outside world. And finally, F for foot protection. Wear sturdy shoes that are waterproof and puncture-proof or resistant. Steel or composite-toed shoes, shanks are recommended, as there may be sharp materials like glass or nails in recovery areas. Closed-toed shoes, even while working in an enclosed space away from the recovery zone, is still important to protect your feet. Waterproof shoes will prevent conditions like trench foot. So other precautions that you might want to take. I don't want to take the time to necessarily read all of these. These slides will be available to you so you can go through them. Most of them sort of are things that you would probably think about when working in an area that might be contaminated with different things. Some things are helpful, just sort of helpful hints like bringing extra clothes with you, and making sure to look out for other kinds of hazards such as downed trees, power lines, etc. So how can you help others? Psychological first aid is one way to help those around you that are in distress and might need help, because that is another health and safety thing that we need to think about. It's basically the emotional equivalent of applying physical first aid to someone who has cut themselves or sprained an ankle. And this technique is designed to reduce initial distress by traumatic events and to foster short and long-term adaptive functioning. You help the person to center themselves so that they can tap into the ways that they have been successful in the past with managing stressful situations. And anyone can do this. This is not therapy. It doesn't need to be done by a licensed social worker or a therapist. It's a matter of connecting with the distressed person, help to provide safety and comfort, and assist them with making connections with others to assist with their current needs and concerns. And part of our resource document includes a YouTube video that shows you how to go through this process. So, and other things to think about, remember to take care of yourself. Frequent breaks, resting in shady, cool areas, drinking lots of water and non-alcoholic beverages, high protein, low salt snacks. Share your feelings, be mindful of your own mental health, and make sure you take breaks from the news and participate in activities that make you happy and joyful. So the QR code that you see there will take you to the list of resources in a Google Doc that you should be able to download, print, whatever you need to do, download and save to your computer. There's also the same document in a tiny URL listed here, tinyurl.com/first PPE. And Christy has already given you the number for the National Heritage Responders. I'm showing it again. So you can give us a call if you need anything. And that is the end of my presentation. Thank you for listening. Stay safe. And now I pass the torch to Brandy Howard.
All right, let me get my slides up. All right. Thank you, Tara. I'm Brandy Howard, a senior project manager and practice lead for the Rocky Mountain division at Terracon. I've worked on asbestos and industrial hygiene projects for over 15 years now, including several responses to national disasters that have come up over that time period. I also serve as the vice chair of the American Industrial Hygiene Association's Museum and Cultural Heritage Industry Working Group, where we work on addressing a number of different health and safety hazards in the museum industry, including developing best practice guidelines. Feel free to reach out to me after this meeting if you would like to get more involved in that group. Hello, this is works very well, but the types of disasters I'm talking to or including in this presentation are related to severe storms. I know around here in Colorado, we get a ton of damage from hailstorms. Also hurricanes, tornadoes, flooding, and wildfires, the number of natural weather disasters with damages of more than $1 billion has increased over the last 40 years from an average of 3.3 per year during the 1980s to about 17 or more per year in the years 2014 to 2023, the last years I could find data for. Nearly 40% of those $1 billion events that have hit the US have been since 2017. And 28 such events occurred in 2023 alone. So I think it's a very good idea to have a plan in place for dealing with the impacts of these events. So why are we talking about disposal requirements to begin with? Well, the impacts from these events can affect worker and occupant safety, as Tara touched upon. They also have environmental implications. Disposal of objects may be regulated and require certain types of testing or certain specific responses. And these requirements can delay projects and cleanup efforts and ultimately impact the cost of a response effort. Tara did touch on a lot of these things, but these building related hazards are going to impact your objects as well. I won't go into too much detail about asbestos, lead, mercury, PCBs, but basically your buildings have hazardous materials in them. They can be impacted either by water or fire. And in some cases, fires can concentrate the issues. For example, asbestos was added to many different materials because it changes the properties of those building materials and it makes it more resilient or fire resistant. In the process of burning, though, many of the binders and other materials that kept that asbestos locked up in the matrix burn off, leaving the asbestos fibers behind, making them a lot more hazardous than they are when they're in the built environment. We also get a lot of different byproducts from incomplete combustion, including a variety of different volatile organic compounds, such as PAHs, many of which are known or suspected carcinogens. And then water from these events themselves can be hazardous. In many cases where large flooding has occurred, the flood waters can include sewage from nearby treatment plants, mud, sand, silt, other environmental contaminants. Tara mentioned benzene, but the type of water that's impacting your building is going to affect the response that a restoration company will take in repairing the building. Additionally, water is often used to treat fires. So we also get water damage in other parts of buildings that are impacted by fire. And whenever you have prolonged contact with water, many of the building materials and building contents will be great substrates for mold growth. So objects that you might be looking at that were impacted by your disaster can be impacted in a variety of different ways. Some may be directly impacted, such as they have contact with rising floodwater, or they have soot or ash on them, or they were burned by the fire. Others could be indirectly impacted. Smoke damage from another room, building damage like from an earthquake could dislodge asbestos-containing materials into a room or on contents. Other things you need to be aware of in some cases are the objects that you're looking to dispose may be inherently hazardous. Inherent hazards are those that come directly from the object or related to the object that were either part of the object's construction or incorporated as they were made. Many acquired hazards also exist, like former pesticide treatments or mold damage from flooding. A lot of those acquired hazards aren't going to require special disposal requirements, with a few exceptions, but some of those inherent hazards may make things more complicated. It's important to consider that there are a few different types of hazards to look at when you are looking at disposing of objects. All right, so some objects or objects with some special hazards are going to require additional handling or precautions during disposal. This is certainly not an exhaustive list, but a couple examples to consider. Deteriorated old film can be particularly hazardous. Cellulose nitrate's highly flammable. acetate film off gases a variety of different toxic vapors. Degrading plastics can pose some similar off-gassing problems. Proper storage of those, right, is critical to protecting those collections. But in the case of a disaster, that may not have been well preserved. If you're dealing with acetate film that is deteriorated, you're likely going to need to work with your fire department or police department to get those items removed. Don't try to handle those yourself. Chemistry or pharmaceutical collections can be inherently hazardous and may require special handling or packaging when you want to get those disposed. I would recommend working with a hazardous waste professional to get those characterized and properly packaged and disposed of. Similarly, some displays or mounts may be made of asbestos-containing materials or coated in heavy metal paints, or be made out of mercury or other hazardous materials in their construction, and or as part of the damage of your building. And in these cases, you should discuss with a consultant or a hazardous waste disposal company prior to disposing those type of materials. There are several guidelines that are published and exist that we rely on in our field that help determine what protocols are acceptable for cleaning, how clean is, and then aid in determining what needs to be disposed of. These documents contain a lot of different information about how those decisions are made on what to keep and what to dispose, and are relied on heavily in our industry. Much of the discussion, though, comes down to what the material of the object you're considering for cleaning and disposal are made out of. Non-porous objects cannot be penetrated by water, and typically mold does not grow on these objects. We're talking about the things like glass, coated ceramics, vinyl, plastic, metal. Similarly, if they're impacted by smoke particles or asbestos fibers, you can usually wash or clean the item. Logically, I think most people get that these things can be cleaned. On the other end of the spectrum, we have our porous items, things like paper, fabric. These items can be saturated with water, and mold can grow throughout the matrix of items made from these materials. These materials can often be very difficult to clean, and the impacts from a disaster may have changed or permanently altered the matrix of the object. Think of water-damaged books or smoke-penetrating soft-covered furniture. These items are typically disposed of after an event. And then to make things more complicated, the industry has come up with the term semi-porous to describe items that may or may not be effectively cleaned. These things might include wood, plaster, concrete, durable items that may have some porous properties, but could be cleaned or treated depending on the extent of the impact. Additionally, the value of the object may come into play on whether or not a restoration is attempted. The cost of the labor to clean an object, or if the cost of the labor to clean an object greatly exceeds the value of the object may be disposed of instead of cleaned, where a high value item may justify cleaning and attempts to measure or clear contamination. So I just thought I would touch really quick on a couple different example projects that I've worked on to explain some of that process once you have a disaster impact to a building. This particular building here housed a visitor center that was under reconstruction when a fire happened. It was a building on the historical register. I had previously performed an asbestos and lead-containing paint assessment at this site. And as I mentioned, one of the things about asbestos is everything else might burn, but that asbestos is now just more available than it was before. So when I got to the site, I found out that the day before, staff at this facility had gone on site and was trying to sift through the ashes to locate artifacts and pieces of this historic property they might want to preserve. Work was stopped on that project before I got there. And then as part of my visit, I provided asbestos awareness training and had a brainstorming session with the staff to figure out how to recover elements of the building structure, like door hinges and window closures that were metal and could be recovered from the fire and clean. We did PPE training. We went over various engineering controls, like using water to control dust during sifting and sorting. and the rest of the contents, what little were left, were disposed of with the remaining building debris by the abatement contractor. And then in this example, a fire took place in the basement of an old courthouse. The fire was started and took off near where the COVID stockpile was located in the basement, and included things that are really great for accelerating a fire, like hand sanitizer. During the firefighting effort, the fire department had the facility maintenance workers turn on the HVAC system to clear the smoke so they could see what was going on. And in that process, the smoke wound up contaminating the HVAC system of the adjacent building. In this case, we had a mix of things that were a total loss, objects that could be cleaned, and some contents that fell somewhere in the middle. The building was also on the historic register and had significant amounts of lead and asbestos containing materials that were directly impacted by the fire, and a lot of other objects that were indirectly impacted by smoke damage and the water damage from the firefighting efforts. Contents that weren't directly impacted by the fire and water were mostly cleaned with HEPA vacuums where that was feasible. Porous items like ceiling tiles, cubicle walls, fabric covered chairs were disposed of and replaced in most cases. Depending on how impacted the area was, contents like computers, books, files were mostly HEPA vacuumed or wiped down and kept, but a lot of it came down to the amount of smoke that was in the area of impact and whether or not there were residual odors after that first cleaning. So I'm not going to touch on the implications of disposal from collections. It's not really my background as an environmental engineer and industrial hygienist. I'm just going to assume that you guys know your collections and all the ethical implications. And after you've done the research, you've decided that there are objects that need to be disposed of either due to health concerns or impacts from the disaster. So once that decision has been made, you do have a couple of options. One of the easiest things to do is going to be involving your remediation contractor or disaster response company. Likely in this scenario, your building's been impacted, so you've already got them on contract. They already have written standard operating procedures and methods and contracts in place to safely dispose of the objects, and they can likely help even if they're hazardous or special waste. That being said, you should engage in the process. For example, I got a few phone calls after Hurricane Helen hit Asheville, North Carolina from different boutique hotels who were asking about what they could do with their original art pieces that had impacts from the flooding. And I referred them to a few specialty practices that could help them out. I don't personally know what it would take to restore an item like artwork versus the cost of replacement. So I'm not really the right person to help make that decision as to whether or not they could be saved or disposed of. However, once that decision's been made, I can help you figure out how to dispose of the items. Few of the companies I referred them to not only perform restoration of art pieces, but they also assist with valuation, which is an important consideration when you're working with an insurance company and you have coverage for your contents. As part of this process, you really should keep a list, photos can help, of all of the things you dispose of for those insurance records. There are a couple of things to keep in mind if you're going to be disposing of items yourself. I'm just going to touch real quickly on RCRA. RCRA is the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act of 1976. We sometimes call this the Cradle to Grave Act, as it aims to protect human health and the environment by governing all the ways that we handle and dispose of solid and hazardous wastes. It's administered by the EPA and different state agencies. And one of the things you need to determine is if the material you're handling is considered hazardous or special waste or just ordinary waste. For special waste, we're talking about things like asbestos contaminated objects, and these should be handled by a professional. If you're going to go down the disposal path in a building that had asbestos impacted materials, these should be handled and disposed of by trained professionals, likely the same ones that are working on your building. For hazardous waste, usually it's an object that's made up of or coated with material that is hazardous. Think objects made out of lead. I would call the landfill where you're intending to take these objects, your waste management company for your business, for example, would be a good person to call, and then discuss the nature of the objects. Many books, paper products, household type goods are going to be solid waste that you can dispose of in your normal trash. If you have a large quantity, you can order a dumpster. If you have something unique or that you know could be hazardous, a collection of old medicine jars, objects made out of lead, or suspected to be coated in large quantities of lead paint, something that has a mercury switch, things like that, you should work with your landfill to determine the best course of action. You may wind up having to hire a specialty company to come out, package, and transport that waste for you. And then other things to keep in mind is if you have a large quantity of hazardous waste, more than 220 pounds, and this needs to include any hazardous waste that are being generated from the building itself by the restoration contractor, you may have additional requirements under the EPA to create a generator license. And if you have more than 2,200 pounds of hazardous waste, there are additional requirements that kicked in. There are often exemptions from the hazardous waste disposal requirements for large national disasters or large natural disasters, things like hurricanes or wildfires that impact a very large area, in which case the landfill will accept waste that it wouldn't normally without a lot of profiling and things. So that's something to be aware of if you are part of a large natural disaster. And reach out and work with different professionals to help you out. And then PPE, just a call back now to Tara's talk, make sure that when you're handling objects and items that were impacted by disasters, you take care of your personal safety. I really like that SHELF acronym. But yes, gloves, disposable clothing, eye protection, respiratory protection are all very important. And when you can, work in outdoor air or ventilated spaces. And it looks like this phone number is going to be in everybody's presentations perhaps, but I did put the National Heritage Responder Hotline here. And I have a couple of other fact sheets that can help you if you decide to salvage something versus disposal. And now I'm going to turn it over to Kerith.
I will share my slides. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kerith Koss Schrager. I'm head of conservation at the National September 11th Memorial and Museum. I am also an industrial hygienist who specializes in hazardous collection materials. It is my pleasure to represent the collection and the preservation strategies of the 9/11 Memorial Museum in the discussion of recovery and care of potentially hazardous artifacts after a disaster. Throughout the presentation, there will be images of destruction and trauma, which includes depictions of people on 9/11. However, there are no images of human remains. This can be emotional and difficult content, but images have been carefully selected for context. There will be a red asterisk in the corner as a warning for images of 9/11 or recovered artifacts in the following slide. Having said that, I'd like to begin with this image of a Lower Manhattan storefront covered in debris that is being recovered originally for the New York Historical Society and is now on permanent display in our collection as representative of the scope of the material within this museum. I recognize that 9/11 represents a unique scenario compared to most museums recovering after a disaster. However, these types of rapid response collections are becoming more prevalent as we recognize the importance of memorializing and documenting traumatic events. Or you may be part of an institution where the integration of the disaster narrative into the history of the collection may be important. But there are some universal things to consider if you want to reclaim collections that have been contaminated after a disaster. The first is that hazardous collections can be safely displayed and handled as long as you have the resources to do so. Objects should be considered individually. There may be not one wholesale approach. Hazards should be considered against the object's importance. Although it may be a difficult decision, removal of part of the artifact or the entire object can be the ethical choice. And it's important to consider stakeholder opinions. Finally, communication between collections and health and safety professionals is essential to really understand the hazards and risks specific to your scenario. Once part of a collective imagery of a global generation, the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center dominated the New York skyline. The collapse of the towers following the terrorist attacks on September 11th, 2001, was a catastrophic loss that resulted in cascading effects over the next 2 decades. Like most disasters, the destruction and randomness of these atrocities is remarkable, as demonstrated by the relative survival of the Sphere sculpture, which was once featured in the World Trade Center Plaza. Almost 2 million tons of debris was removed from Ground Zero to be sorted as part of the 9-month recovery operation and as an active criminal investigation. The concept of a dedicated museum was not even a notion at these early stages, as materials were shipped to Freshkills landfill on Staten Island and for sorting through the massive amounts of material. Workers often, but not always, followed health and safety protocols, which today should be standard practice, as Tara mentioned, in part as a direct result of the health effects associated with 9/11 exposures. In that regard, I want to highlight the Health and Safety Network's publication, Health and Safety and Emergency Response, which emphasizes, as Tara mentioned, that artifact recovery is a secondary response and that human safety is always the priority. Thanks to the foresight and fortitude of cultural heritage workers from other established organizations, government and recovery workers were convinced of the value of searching for and saving materials that could someday end up in a museum. Seen here is the current 9/11 chief curator, Dr. Jan Ramirez, who at the time was with the New York Historical Society. And she, along with other individuals from the New York State Museum, were given extraordinary access to Freshkills to highlight potential objects for museum collections. Objects were then moved to Hangar 17 at JFK International Airport, where they underwent transformation from evidence to artifacts within climate-controlled tanks. At this point, the concept of a dedicated museum had materialized. If you're interested in the curatorial rationale for selecting certain objects as they relate to the narrative and experience of 9/11 victims, survivors, and of the World Trade Center site itself, including the remnants of the Calder sculpture pictured here, this is a great interview with Dr. Ramirez about those deliberations. By 2014, this collection had culminated into the museum. The World Trade Center Plaza seen here has been transformed into a memorial with twin reflecting pools which bear the victims' names and the footprints of the original towers. The mission of the museum is to remember and honor the 2,983 people killed in the horrific attacks of September 11th and the 1993 World Trade Center bombings, as well as those who risked their lives to save others and all who demonstrated extraordinary compassion in the aftermath of the attacks. It also serves to preserve the memories and evidence of 9/11 for an increasing generation with no lived memory of 9/11. The more recently dedicated memorial plate recognizes the deaths and illnesses associated with toxic exposures on and after 9/11, which have impacted survivors, recovery workers, and Lower Manhattan residents. The museum itself resides 7 stories below ground in the archaeological foundations of the World Trade Center site. Through these in situ remnants, art installations, recovered artifacts, and audiovisual exhibitions, the story of 9/11 is told with the voices of the people who directly experienced it. This mission is supported by the museum's collection, which encompasses a variety of categories. I'm going to focus on the recovered artifacts, which range in size from large pieces of structural steel to individual items belonging to victims. In some instances, these objects may be surrogates for individuals whose remains were never recovered or identified. When recovering these objects and considering them for inclusion in the museum, the toxicity of the dust that coated them was a primary concern. Dust clouds remain one of the most indelible images of that day and its aftermath, the handling of which I will go into in more detail later on. But first, I want to mention that we had experienced another disaster in our short history. In October 2012, as the museum was under construction and large artifacts had already been installed, Superstorm Sandy flooded Lower Manhattan and the museum, as well as our offsite storage facilities. Here you can see the flooded foundation hall with the fire truck and other large artifacts covered with their protective coverings, but definitely submerged. Conservation staff continues to see the effects of flooding with salt efflorescence and leaking liquids from these vehicles. As part of our close relationship with the 9/11 community, Ladder 3 had previously been cleaned and abated by the New York City Fire Department, and they returned to assist draining it again post-Sandy. And for a more detailed description of that process and our relationship with them, we have this great blog post available on our website. Learning from this event and our previous experience with recovered artifacts, we now have a disaster plan in place in case of flooding events, which involves retaining an art handling company to cover and remove selected high priority artifacts to safer sites. Dealing with the implication of toxic dust, which coated everything and everyone in Lower Manhattan, is a significant part of our collection policies at the museum. For both recovery scenarios, the events of 9/11 and Sandy, it was essential to identify the potential hazards that both museum workers and visitors could be exposed to. The health and safety implications of the dust in September of 2001 and the months that followed were not universally appreciated. Health and safety professionals recognized the immediate dangers, but the public was collecting dust and dust-covered objects as mementos, only later growing concerned and then outraged as health conditions began to emerge. The reaction from first responders was mixed and complicated by the urgency to find survivors, and later for collection workers, the desire to collect items from the site. Within days of 9/11, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency issued assurances that the air quality in Lower Manhattan was not a cause for concern. In the museum community, by December 2001, these perspectives began to coalesce. For example, AIC presented guidelines detailing the specific risks associated with the dust and making recommendations for safe work practices. However, this information did not necessarily get to the wider collecting community, who was actively sorting through contaminated artifacts. At the museum, toxicologists and environmental health specialists determined that testing for the distinctive signature of lead, asbestos, and man-made vitreous fibers would be an effective means of verifying World Trade Center dust on the artifacts, although the dust contains a mixture, as Tara explained, of all the pulverized contents of a high-rise building. Testing the museum's recovered artifacts for these contaminants of potential concern provides information that the concentrations of contaminants present. How we approach the dust is outlined universally in our comprehensive operation and maintenance plan. However, each object is considered individually. This is a slide that I show in most of my lectures to highlight that hazard control within a cultural heritage context can be extremely complex, largely because it can be directly at odds with the canonical health and safety priorities of the hierarchy of controls on the left, where the most effective strategy is to eliminate the hazard. Eliminating our collections is the last thing we want to do, and so we rely heavily on the less effective techniques. There are various solutions to this problem, which I will highlight. The first is that elimination doesn't mean deaccessioning or necessarily mean deaccessioning or disposing of your object. Cleaning or abatement can be an effective means of eliminating the hazard. This can be a complex decision-making process, particularly if the act of cleaning could remove important components of your object. Our large vehicles and pieces of steel are examples of artifacts we have abated, which allows them to be on open display within the museum. Here you can see the evolution of one of the ambulances from fresh kills to museum exhibition. Originally, curators had wanted to display these vehicles with the dust, as seen in the upper right. However, after identifying asbestos, it was clear that this would involve encasing it within a vitrine. Because these objects could withstand the abatement process, dust and debris was removed so that physical destruction of the object could be closely experienced by visitors. Removal of the dust was a complicated discussion. As cultural heritage workers, we continue to grapple with how to balance safety concerns with competing interests such as authenticity. The museum is distinct from most collecting institutions in that it serves as a memorial to lives lost during a tragic attack in recent history. The museum's collection is a material witness that carries a specific emotional gravity and bears evidence to physical violence. In many cases, the hazardous material may be an integral and inseparable part of the object's cultural identity. Although World Trade Center dust is a serious health hazard, removing it from an object is complicated by its cultural significance. Whereas many collecting institutions mitigate damage to collection items, the conservators and staff at the 9/11 Memorial Museum preserve damage as a fundamental marker of cataclysmic events. For many objects, we rely heavily on isolation. Museums are ethically mandated to make their collections accessible as well as safeguard their facilities, and therefore we strive to display these artifacts whenever possible. Storage and display conditions are carefully managed to protect against potential exposure. For artifacts under a certain size, even if there is no visible dust present, casework can provide the necessary protection. On the right here, you can see the Chelsea Jeans installation, which I showed in the first slide, which has been completely encased and can only be accessed by properly trained asbestos handlers. But a significant amount of resources are dedicated to our administrative engineering controls and PPE protocols. Our operations and management plan and maintenance plan, which outlines protocols to handle, store, and exhibit these artifacts, prioritizes human safety. This includes labeling all storage containers for World Trade Center recovered artifacts, training requirements for personnel, as well as procedures for environmental inspections, testing artifacts, housekeeping, and emergency response. The plan was designed to be a living document, which will evolve over time. Regular evaluations and revisions ensure conformity with changing regulations, state-of-the-art procedures, and the conditions of the museum and each storage location. It also serves to bolster public trust, particularly among stakeholder groups who have experienced the effects of dust exposure firsthand. It is a time-consuming and expensive process, and roughly to date, only 1/7 of our recovered objects have been tested. The detailed explanation of these policies was published in 2001 for the American Industrial Hygiene Association, and this article also covers a lot of the topics that I've covered today. In recognition that most of you will be dealing with issues of cleaning your collections rather than recovering trauma collections for your institutions, I'll finish here with a couple questions to ask yourself, and because we're short on time, you can review them in the available PDF handout that comes along with this presentation, as well as these resources, which are specific to our collection that you might find helpful for further understanding our decision and collections policies. So thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Kerith. I'm going to go ahead and invite all of our panelists to pop back on the screen. We have a few minutes for questions, so I want to make sure to do that. But before we do that, I want to put in the chat a link to our resources. We had mentioned that we have copies of all of these presentations available for all of you guys to see on our website, and also a list of resources that you can look at. There's also an evaluation link. We still take those very seriously. They help us with future programming, so please do fill them out if you're able to. And also a quick note that we have recorded today's program, because someone asked that in the chat as well. One question that already came in was, which Terry, you answered, but I want to go ahead and talk a little bit about as well, is does one need a new Tyvek suit each day of the recovery effort? Could you talk a little bit about that and just kind of the use of PPE in this situation?
So when you're utilizing protective personal equipment, with the exception of a half mask respirator that you've had fit tested for that you've purchased, it's meant for a one-time use, right? So your N95 you shouldn't use repeatedly, your gloves you shouldn't use repeatedly, any sort of coveralls, and your shoes you can use repeatedly. But for the Tyvek, the gloves, like things that would be meant to be disposable should be disposed of. The fewer times you have to expose yourself to things that have already been exposed to the potential hazard, that's less risk, right? So that's really what you want to be. That's what you're aiming for. So yeah. Tyvek suits, use them once.
It fights against everyone pushes sustainability so much now and how we should reuse. And I came up back in my beginning day, it was white gloves. Everyone, that's all I used was white gloves, and people would always wash them. And I remember even thinking back then, like, are we sure like that everything's clean out of them? So I think and I do think, you can still use white gloves. You can still do that in certain cases, but I do think that that note of this is a case, these things were only meant to be used once, right? They're not meant to be used over and over again, is a very good point. This question came in, if your building has an HVAC system and there's smoke, should we shut the HVAC down so it is not contaminated? Brandy, you answered that, but do you mind verbalizing your answer as well?
Sure. In more modern HVAC systems, they're often tied in with your alarm system. So when the fire alarm goes off, your HVAC turns off. If it's safe to do so, turning off your HVAC isn't a bad idea because it will prevent the spread of the smoke throughout your building. And a lot of the cleanup, particularly in partially built structures that I deal with, is related to where that smoke goes throughout a building. All that being said, your safety is the most important thing. So if it's not safe, just leave. And then 2, if your fire department asks you to turn on the HVAC so that it can clear the smoke so that they can better see the source of a fire or put out a fire, you know, follow the directions of your fire department.
Perfect, thank you. Kerith, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more when you were doing your presentation. You know, obviously there was a consideration between like the curation side of the house and then like the health and safety side of the house. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that, because our audience is predominantly small and mid-size. And I think sometimes, especially folks who've gone through an emergency or disaster, there will be items that their folks are going to be like, but we still want to put this on exhibit, and knowing that it could be harmful, you know, is going to be an issue from our standpoint. So could you talk a little bit more about just that process and kind of how your museum handled it and kind of the considerations that you guys did?
Yeah, for sure. You know, I think whenever I give presentations about hazardous collections, I'm like beating the drum that just because something is hazardous doesn't mean you have to get rid of it. It doesn't mean you have to deaccession it, but you do have to have the ability to care for it properly. So if you don't have the resources to do that, and fortunately we were in a scenario where we had a lot of resources available to us, you know, it is a path that you can go down, but it is, you know, resource heavy to care for that collection. And you also have to make sure that it's something that can go on in perpetuity, so that like once the person who knows the protocol leaves, you know, the next person isn't left like, what's in this box type thing, which I saw sort of leads to the hazardous collection labeling that someone else had a question about too. So yes, you should be labeling your hazardous collections. So for us, it was extremely complicated because we did have this hazard that was very well known, and we had a very engaged stakeholder population that was adamant that we could not be exposing visitors and museum workers to this hazard. So from the very beginning of this collection, we dealt with the hazard. We also have an outside industrial hygiene company that does all of our testing for us. So it's not something that's done in-house just because of the quantity of things that we have. So we did have this dynamic where the curators wanted to show dust on things. And that one example I gave where they came back and said asbestos, we can't do this without sort of investing in a vitrine that would cover this. And it led to really sort of fruitful discussions between health and safety professionals and curators, which is why I said this communication is really important, that ultimately they decided that the story being told by that ambulance and the story being told by that fire truck was about the physicality and the force of the events of 9/11, and the dust, we tell the dust story somewhere else. And so we could abate that object and have it tell the story about the physical nature of 9/11 instead. But it is a very difficult conversation to have when people don't want to invest in health and safety, but also making the argument that it's going to save you time and money down the road, because 50% of the objects that we test come back clear. We have to assume that everything recovered from ground zero is contaminated until we test it. 50 of them come back clear. That's 50% of things that we don't have to put in plastic bags, that we don't have to wear PPE for, that we don't have to dispose of as hazardous waste.
Perfect, thank you. Oh, sorry, go ahead. Do you have anything else?
I can answer the labeling question too.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, so someone's asking, is there a good place to buy stickers or tags to get hazardous?
So, you know, I do a lot of hazardous materials surveys for people, and we come up with like a unique labeling system that for that in particular institution, because you want to make sure that your staff is going to understand what what is happening, but you also want to think about people who, like the firefighters that come in, if there is a hazard, like they will also be able to understand the hazard that is, someone who's not familiar with your collection. We tend to do globally harmonized system of hazard communication labels if you can identify what your hazard is. So if you know you have lead, there's like a sticker that you can purchase that has a lead hazard for it. But ours that we use at the museum are those bright yellow stickers you saw in the boxes. We just print those out ourselves. If somebody sees them, it knows there's a hazard associated from across the room and then can read the specific handling things once they get closer. I don't know if anyone else has sort of stock stickers that they know or anything they know.
Yeah.
But it's not bad to print them out yourself. It's just you want something that's alerting people when they come into the room.
We use
Yes.
we use a Brother P Touch at the library and just make our own labels.
Yeah, I think it's more it sounds silly. It's almost like the color is the thing that'll identify them. Like I think if all your labels are black and white, I've experienced this as a registrar. Like if all your labels are black and white, they all just start looking the same to me. But like even if they have different symbols, but if you color code them, that has a little bit more of a quick recognition in my view.
Yeah, I mean the issue with the GHS labels is if you don't know what like a flaming O means, it's not helpful for anyone. So there's training that goes along with making sure your staff understands what your symbols and your labels mean.
It's like looking at laundry symbols on clothing, and I'm like, I don't know what that means. So I end up Googling it every time. Real quick, and I'll wrap up with this. Someone put a comment in the chat saying, I found some staff and volunteers being so proud of reusing their nitrile gloves by turning them inside out. I've heard of that as well. I also heard of a recent training. It was by the folks over at Heart that they talked about using gloves, like testing gloves. They put in, Christy, I think you heard about this training too, I think, so correct me if I'm wrong, but they basically put like ketchup or something in bowls, and then they put their hands with the gloves in the ketchup to see if they were like permeable and stuff. So that might be a fun trick to show people, to be like, these gloves, you know what I mean? Like they protect, but only to a certain level, which I found kind of fascinating when I was here.
Yeah, what they did was they were actually learning to put on and take off the gloves. So they were using the ketchup to sort of demonstrate when you're taking it off, how much of the residue actually ends up on your hands as you're removing them if you're not using the proper technique. And people were really struggling with it. It was actually interesting. So
yeah, I mean, it kind of gives you the same idea. So anyway, I just thought that was a fun thing. Well, Christy, do you want to do one quick last plug for May Day while we wrap up our program, so we have a couple minutes?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. So again, the idea behind May Day is to spend the month of May on emergency preparedness and just doing one thing, anything that you can do to increase your emergency preparedness. And I will find that link again and drop it back in the chat for you all to please visit our website, check out our May Day resources, and also then fill out our survey to let us know what you did. And so that's the survey link, and I will go get the May Day link for you as well.
Great. And while you're doing that, I'm going to do a huge shout out to all of our presenters. Thank you, Brandy, Kerith, Tara, and Christy for all presenting on this important thing today. I'm here with the double hat. I am the other co-chair of National Heritage Responders, so I'm always glad to talk about the program and how we can come out to serve. There was also a recent article in the Art newspaper written by the executive director of AIC talking about just NHR and kind of recent federal actions that might impact those programs. So I would encourage you guys to go take a look at that article as well to see how you can help out all of our programs and all of these fabulous things that are going on right now. So again, thank you, everyone. Thank you to our presenters. And we will be back in June. Keep an eye on our website. We will have that summer programming, so keep an eye on it. So thanks again. Have a great beginning of the summer, and we'll see you in a few weeks.